2024 has been the biggest year this decade so far. Literally, it's a leap year, and that means even more time for video games. And 2024 has been in no shortage of tremendous games either, such as Call of Duty Black Ops 6 to the small but mighty like Balatro. Each and every month, the players here at Game Rant have been attempting to play everything before the year's end, which is why we turned to you, dear viewer, and asked, which game deserves a Game of the Year nomination for 2024? And boy, did you answer! Actually, most of you just said Black Myth Wukong, which is fine, we'll get to that in a bit. But as always, I'm looking for the most interesting posts in this week's Gamers Set. So let's crack on. As always, to prove it's never too late to submit an answer, I plucked the very latest response from Exodo, who says, Sparking Zero, short and sweet Exodo, and there's plenty of Dragon Ball Z fans standing up for Dragon Ball Sparking Zero. And for good reason. After decades of begging for some sort of follow-up to the exceptional Dragon Ball Budokai Tenkaichi series, this game delivered the unique perspective and controls of those third-person brawlers. And really, it's to the credit of Spike Chunsoft they were able to recapture the spirit of this lost franchise. Now, personally speaking, I haven't played it myself, as I'm still legally banned from Dragon Ball games after spamming Super 17 in Budokai Tenkaichi 3. Oh well, will this take Game of the Year? Probably not, but it's exactly the type of answers I like to see. Up next is hands down the single most popular answer. In fact, it feels a bit unfair to pick just one response, but let's go with the latest one. Jamie, who says, quote, Black Myth Wukong deserves Game of the Year 2024, end quote. And when it comes to sleeper hits, few have hit harder than Black Myth Wukong. We're talking a digital-only game that's single player, and that means we're witnessing a real change to the video game market, when a Souls-like can drop on consoles out of nowhere and cause a real frenzy. Black Myth Wukong is also dripping with production value and punctuated with crisp combat. There really aren't many games that can compete with this degree of polish, and it's quickly turned developer game science from obscurity to global sensation. Frankly, if our answers are anything to go by, the popular choice for 2024 will be Black Myth Wukong, and it's not even close. Up next is Charles, who chimes in with a dark horse, quote, Grand Blue should be absolutely Game of the Year. It has great graphics, fight scenes, and flow of the game make it awesome to play, end quote. Again, I don't think Grand Blue Fantasy Relink is going to be taking home any awards this year, though it did review quite well. And yes, it may be a bit predictable, but after a long day at work or school, coming home to some breezy fun anime fantasy is more than good enough. Heck, the story only runs about 20 hours, and most players stick around just because they enjoy the world and presentation that much. Once you've sunk 100 hours into a game, do you really care if the score was an 8 or a 9? Either way, it's going to be your personal Game of the Year. Great answer. Up next is Harrison, who says, quote, Honestly, Balatro deserves a shout, end quote. And Dana quickly follows, quote, I came here to say this. I'm at 300 plus hours and still play more days than not, end quote. Now, here's another game that you may not have heard of, but given all the crossovers it's currently doing with the likes of Cyberpunk 2077 and its featured spot on the Apple Arcade, it's gonna be hard to miss this endlessly addictive card game. Now, truth be told, dear viewer, I never quite understood poker, which always made those sections in Red Dead Redemption awkward, and so I frankly haven't a clue what the heck I was doing for the first 2 or so hours. And it started to feel like this game was haunted, because time just evaporated. I too sunk over 100 hours into this devilishly fun card game. Again, if someone with my poker experience can get into Balatro, anyone can. Up next is Keith with short and sweet but lots of enthusiasm, quote, Animal Well, end quote. And here's another game that spiked the yearly reviews, but has seemingly left the minds of many players. And that's a shame. Animal Well is certainly a video game in the most classic sense, and yet upon review, it's bewildering to realize all the possibilities the game has. A true throwback to the PC era of Euro platformers like the ZX Spectrum or BBC Micro. This spooky little Metroidvania continuously produces some of the most compelling mechanics of the year. The sound effects alone deserve a nomination in my book. This is one heck of a gem. Up next is Woo, who says, quote, Space Marine 2 for Game of the Year 2024. An epic experience from start to finish, both visually and audio-wise. The progression of Titus's story was well done, end quote. And here's a real dark horse candidate. Say what you will about Space Marine 2, it's not exactly the most versatile game, but this approach means injecting players directly into the dark, grim, explosive violence of the Warhammer 40k universe. You may not have the freedom to explore a large world, and yes, it's only a dozen or so hours long, not including multiplayer, but it hits all the high notes without any filler. And in a world where there's too many games and not enough time, I appreciate that. Omnix is Brian with another dark horse. Quote, Zenless Zone Zero for animation at least, end quote. Will Zenless Zone Zero be nominated for Game of the Year? Probably not, and it probably shouldn't be, but Brian is being specific in his wording here when he highlights the game's animation. Now, personally speaking, I'm a bit torn here. The cutscene animation looks pretty good, but the gameplay animation, it's not extraordinary. It's good though. Nice poses, legible action, fun camera tricks. When it comes to this kind of game, there's really not much more you could ask for. So a respectable answer for a personal list, but that's going to be a tricky one to convince others. Good answer though. James chimes in with another banger from earlier this year, quote, Tekken 8, end quote. And there's frankly no argument from me here. As a Tekken fan who had fallen off for a bit, I found Tekken 7 way too defense-based for my liking. Well, Tekken 8 is about as aggressive as a 3D fighter can get, and it's a stone-cold masterpiece for it. Not only do the rage and heat systems create a balanced game for all players of all skill levels, Namco went ahead and offered up an alternative control scheme just to get players warmed up. And on top of that, there's a whole story mode based around the arcade scene that teaches people not only the basics of combat, but the importance of being nice in public. And anyone who does that is the real king of Iron Fist in my book. Next is Earl, who picks the cutest game of the year, quote, Astrobot, end quote. And this answer popped up quite a few times. Astrobot was a fun journey through the history of the PlayStation brand, and serves as a follow-up to the Astrobot games that had previously come with the Sony consoles like Astro's Playroom. Frankly, it was a bit of a surprise to see, not only because Sony hasn't focused on the platformer genre for a couple of generations now, but because it's so freely referenced franchises that haven't seen a follow-up in decades. Even if you don't think you have PlayStation nostalgia, there's at least one moment in Astrobot for everyone. It's a special little game. John chimes in with a top 3 with some familiar titles. Quote, here are my top 3 votes for this year. In order, Echoes of Wisdom, Astrobot, Black Myth Wukong, end quote. Echoes of Wisdom. Oh, you mean The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom? And I'm right there with you, John. Geez, Nintendo fans, we know it's a lame duck year waiting for Switch 2, but you have a brand new Zelda game on your current console. Now, Echoes does lack the 3D perspective that many have come to expect from mainline Zelda games, but it makes up for it with pure play. This time out, you are Zelda, and you'll be using your magical powers to duplicate almost everything in an effort to save Hyrule. Yeah, maybe those themes don't really come together, but it's mostly a game about goofing off, and I for one enjoy goofing off. And yeah, new Zelda game. Hasn't even been a couple of months. You'd think it would have gotten a few more mentions here. Up next is Lake with another top 3, quote, Stellar Blade, Elden Ring DLC, Astrobot, end quote. And really, this answer was selected to talk about yet another sleeper hit, Stellar Blade. This is why I think some of those previous hack and slash games probably won't end up with a nomination. Meanwhile, Stellar Blade literally has the creator of Nier, Yoko Taro, praising the game, claiming he was envious he didn't create it himself. Now, I don't know about you, but when an auteur director like Yoko Taro expresses frustration over how good a game is, you're darn right you need to give it a look. Which won't be a problem, because goodness gracious, the graphics are incredible. The only real concern is if people will remember Stellar Blade, as its April release may hold it back. Look out, it's Shinobi, and he says, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I loved every single moment of it, end quote. And again, here's a game that launched all the way back in February, so maybe some players are overlooking it. But the recent advertisements for the new PlayStation 5 Pro are pushing it as a major title with much improved resolution and frame rate. But as it is, Rebirth is a comically large game, with the most frequent complaint being there's simply too much to do. If that sounds like the sort of problem you'd like to have, there's over 100 hours of jaw-droppingly gorgeous graphics, incredible music, and snug combat to enjoy. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth doesn't get a nomination. I'm going to assume it's because everyone is still too darn busy playing it. We have another list from Sorab, who says, quote, Stellar Blade, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Black Myth, Metaphor Refantasio, end quote. And oh yeah, did everyone forget about the brand new Atlas RPG this year? Metaphor Refantasio is not Persona, but it's also not Persona. It feels like a collection of highly skilled creators giving themselves a break from the shackles of a franchise. At the same time, I can't help but wonder if they had called this game Persona, or at least given it a spin-off title in the same vein as Catherine, if it might have helped its word of mouth. But again, we have a brand new Atlas RPG. Just go listen to the soundtrack. You'll know if it's for you. Up next is Jordan, who says, quote, Final Fantasy Rebirth, and as of now, Metaphor Refantasio, 12 hours in and I'm hooked. Also, I assume it doesn't count as Game of the Year, but Shadow of the Erd Tree would definitely deserve it too. And honestly, as a 60-hour DLC, I think it deserves to be nominated as a full game, end quote. Well, Jordan, you've got us there. Is Shadow of the Erd Tree a game? No, objectively it is not. But neither was the Phantom Liberty DLC for Cyberpunk 2077. So you know what? what? I'm gonna allow it, because it invites the far more contentious conversation of Erdtree going up against the likes of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 as a standalone entry, and frankly, that's a really interesting perspective. Let us know how you feel in the comments below. Next up is Combat Scores, I hope I said that right. Quote, Astrobot, Black Myth Wukong, Animal Well, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, end quote. And I love to see the love for Like a Dragon. This series shouldn't have been a hit in the West, as it's deeply disinterested in the current trends. Well, they flipped the whole combat to JRPG turn-based, and now it takes place in Hawaii. And somehow, this didn't alienate Western audiences. In fact, the franchise is more popular now than ever. And the newest entry will see series mainstay Majima becoming a pirate. These days, life is good for a Like a Dragon fan. Here we have Hist, who says, quote, Black Myth Wukong, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, Stellar Blade, Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, Helldivers 2, end quote. And yes, we didn't get many mentions of Helldivers 2, surprisingly, as this has been the biggest PC hit for Sony and a lightning rod for controversy earlier this year when Sony attempted to force PSN registrations. This game is a not-so-subtle adaptation of the Paul Verhoeven film Starship Troopers, itself an adaptation, and it's dripping with rich irony and horrific satire not usually associated with a game of its popularity. It's one thing for Grand Theft Auto to make fun of radio commercials. It's quite another thing to create an artistic statement through microtransactions. Not to mention the general gameplay and feel of Helldivers 2 is a major detour from conventional locomotion. It's far more clumsy, and it feels like we're starting to see that influence in some of the other biggest games of this year. And lastly this week is Steven with a really smart answer. Quote, Black Myth Wukong, Satisfactory 1.0, Space Marine 2, end quote. Now there's only 3 options here. 1, you've never heard of Satisfactory. 2, you have a friend who's obsessed with Satisfactory and trying to get you to play it. Or 3, you absolutely agree Satisfactory is Game of the Year. I myself am between 2 and 3, only dipping in here and there. But the most recent updates have realized the premise down to the micro scale. We're talking cleverly built conveyor belts that make numbers do numbers. And really, that's about it. But when you see it all humming along after hours of work in perfect harmony without interruption, well, yeah, it's satisfying. I don't know if it has a shot at a nomination, but I don't think most Satisfactory fans will even care. Anyway, we're about to wrap up this video. As always, I love to see what comes up because personally, I always feel like I haven't played a single video game all year. But then I look at my trophies and achievements, and I know that's objectively not true. But right now, as uncool of an answer as it might be, I'm gonna go with Call of Duty Black Ops 6. I have never played a first-person shooter that is simultaneously fast and weighty. It feels like a real moment in game design we'll be encountering for a while. Something tells me 2025 is going to be a year of very heavy shooters. But anyway, I want to thank everyone who provided their answers for this week's Gamer Set. Keep the conversation going on below, and I'll be checking out your answers. Thanks for watching, and we'll chat again next week. Thanks, everybody.